So we've seen these kind of Exodus movements in the Gospel of Luke, right? All Jesus' first disciples were from Galilee, and they left and went with Jesus to Jerusalem, right? We also see the disciples leaving Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus, right? But then when Christ opens their minds to the scriptures and his presence among them in the breaking of the bread, the first Mass, right? On the road to Emmaus, what do? They exit their trip to Emmaus and they make an exodus out of that trip and back to Jerusalem. And we see people dependent on God. And the way that they're dependent is that they're dependent on the people of God. They take care of each other. So the situation where you had basically these oppressed Jews, which most people were rather poor, it forced them into taking care of each other. Because when they had that experience of the risen Christ and the generosity of God came upon them, what happens? Well, they become generous themselves. And they had lots of opportunity to share, the rich among them. And it was few, right? Most were poor. But when the rich among them shared, there was enough for everybody. And it brought great joy to those rich to be able to share their everything, to be able to give all themselves, and to be able to see the others as their brothers and sisters, not as some kind of lower beings that they could lord their wealth over. And so from the perspective of those who had, the poor went from being a burden on them to being an opportunity for generosity, right? Instead of the poor being a burden, right, they helped to share that burden. They took it on themselves. They became part of it. And they have what is in the human nature, that desire for community, right? That joy that's found in love of neighbor. Again, don't take, the gospel's word for it. Check this out yourself. Just be observant. Look and see what actually makes people happy. So we see examples of this. And we see people like Prisca and Aquila, who are rich people. And we're getting to the age here where we have not just Jewish people, but now also Gentiles, non-Jews coming into the church. And we see, of course, God in his generous nature, this generosity and hospitality of God is unlimited. It's not just for the Jews, right? Now through Jesus, it has its full expression, and it's going to be open to everybody. And so we get Greeks who are coming into the church, non-Jews, that is, coming into the church, people of every ethnicity. And we see the early church have these house churches, right, where the people who have these large homes with large courtyards will host, and the whole church will come, right? Rich, poor alike. They will come into that home, and they will experience the breaking of the bread and the sharing of goods, right? Food will be shared with everyone, and the sharing of the faith of the apostles. And if people have needs, they'll be met. Listen to the way Lohfink talks about it. This is on page 215. Thus, the households of Prisca and Aquila offer us a visible image of the new family. Here there is a natural family that does not live for its own sake, but places its house entirely at the disposal of the gospel. That house becomes a base for Paul's mission, first in Greece and then in Asia Minor. And probably the subsequent return to Rome was meant to furnish a base for Paul's intended journey to Spain. At that same time, it becomes the crystallization point for new communities that grow up around this household. So as Paul goes and he would stay with Prisca and Aquila, and the other believers, right, in their Greek city would come and gather at their house. It becomes its own community then, where people are doing this, when Paul's there or not. And they gather together for the same things we saw in the early Jerusalem church. But now it's not just in Jerusalem, right? It's not just in the Jewish capital. It's all over the world in these Greek cities. At the same time, it becomes a crystallization point for new communities that grow up around this household. There they find the necessary place for their gatherings, but much more than that, they find a couple who have placed themselves too entirely at the service of the Gospels. They instruct Apollos, and certainly many others, in the faith. They stick out their necks for Paul in Ephesus. All Gentile Christian communities owe them thanks, as Paul says. I'm going on to page 216 in Lohfink. In the early days of the church, the beginning of new communities always depended on whether there were families like that of Prisca and Aquila who were prepared to move to other cities for the sake of the gospel, and there with their families to become the starting point for a new community. Not only baptism itself, then, was an exodus, right? So this is the second form of exodus. Life of these Christians became a continual exodus for the sake of the building up of the church. So they would move if necessary and set up these house churches in different cities. Lohfink then goes on to talk about how we've seen different forms of exodus throughout history, especially the monastic communities that have flourished in the church. Since then, there's always been an exodus going on in the church. This is page 216 again. It was part of the existence of countless missionaries who left their homelands to make the gospel of Jesus Christ known in other lands. In the lives of those who left their families to live the evangelical councils in monastic communities and religious houses, in the lives of Catholic priests who renounced marriage and family in order to make a visible and symbol something of the eschatological existence of all the baptized. This manifold exodus was by no means intended to be a flight from the world. Its aim was always to recover the complete form of following Jesus, table community, the common life in the new family. The flight of the early ascetics into the desert received its Christian form only in those men and women who created a new kind of community out of the ascetic movement. All this is quite obvious in the Western monasteries, where there's almost always a bit of new society, new culture, transformed world, and their influence reached beyond their walls. Many monasteries that began as new foundations in wild places developed into successful business enterprises, and shaped the entire cultural landscape. So again, he's pointing out that the point of monastic movements is not to leave the world, but to form a new community, a new society. And we see it to make an exodus from the pagan values, where people are in competition with each other, and form a society where people exist to love and help each other. And we see the effects of this all over the world, that this is usually how it works. You do get communities that develop around these monastic communities. Now, he goes on to point out that there's something missing, and that they were always exclusively male or female communities in the monastic tradition. Married people are kind of left out. And then finally, Lohfink in this section does make a call for some kind of new form of exodus today. He says, this is on page 217. Meanwhile, the church is living almost everywhere in the world, subject again to persecutions in the midst of a new paganism. Right? So what is he talking about, new paganism? He's talking about worshiping the gods that are the projection of our selfish desires. So like in the United States, many people will say we live in a consumer culture, where people think, oh, if I can buy this, if I can get a bigger house or a nicer boat or something, that will make me happy. So therefore, they're worshiping that consumerism. They're worshiping the idea if they get stuff, right, that will bring them the joy in life, right? Now think about that. What you think is going to make you happy, that's what you're worshiping, right? So Christianity should be the practice of what? Worshiping love, right? That's what we believe, God who is love. So we believe then that loving others is what is going to make us happy, right? And a love that actually moves us to help others. So the new paganism, people might not say, "Oh, I worship the god of money," right? But in effect, what are they doing? They're devoting their lives to the pursuit of material goods. Why? Why does anybody do that? Why does anybody devote their life to anything? Well, they think it's what's going to make them happy. So that's an example of a new kind of paganism. The church will only survive in that situation if it returns to the to communities constituted according to the New Testament, not in false romanticism of the primitive church, but under the conditions of the third millennium, right? It's not like we're going to go back and have the same form as the early Jerusalem church or the early house churches of Prisca and Aquila. The word return is not really the right one in this context, right? What is wanted is a new dawn, but now with much better knowledge drawn from history. So Lohfink here is calling for a new kind of exodus that creates a society of loving persons in the world today.